a millionaire returns to his hometown after a long time and accidentally saves a homeless girl who is dying on a rainy night. Thought to be grateful, but a few days later, the girl holds a knife to him and screams. The rain hadn't let up since sundown, thick sheets of water slanting against the windshield, blurring the empty road ahead. Joseph adjusted his grip on the wheel, the rhythmic drone of the wipers filling the silence inside the car. He hadn't been back here in over 20 years, yet the road leading to the Montgomery estate felt the same, long, winding, and utterly desolate. He exhaled sharply, glancing at the dashboard clock. Nearly midnight. The town had been a ghost of its former self when he'd driven through earlier. Storefronts dark, streetlights flickering as if reluctant to stay awake. Even the gas station by the highway had looked abandoned, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the rain. He shouldn't have come back. The estate was nothing but a legal obligation, a property his father had washed his hands of years ago. Joseph had no emotional ties to it, no fond memories urging him home. If anything, it felt like a relic of a past he'd long since outgrown. His life was in Chicago, his company, his carefully curated world of sleek offices and fine suits, not damp wooden floors and crumbling southern grandeur. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminated the road for a fraction of a second, just long enough for him to see it. A figure collapsed at the edge of the road. Joseph's foot slammed the brake before his mind fully processed what he'd seen. The tires skidded slightly on the slick pavement, the car fishtailing before stopping a few yards ahead. He swallowed a curse, his pulse hammering as he turned, eyes narrowing through the rain-streaked window. Nothing but darkness. For a moment, he wondered if it had been a trick of the light, a phantom cast by the storm. But then he saw it again, a shape barely distinguishable from the mud and grass, unmoving. He hesitated. The storm was merciless, cold wind seeping through the cracked window, carrying the scent of wet earth. Logic told him to keep driving. Whoever they were, this wasn't his problem. The town had its own authorities, people who handled these things. And yet, he was already pushing the door open, rain pelting against his skin as he stepped out. The wind shoved against him, his coat flaring as he trudged toward the figure. A woman. She was sprawled on her side, half buried in the thick, rain-soaked dirt. Her clothes clung to her frame, heavy with water, her hair plastered against her pale skin. Kneeling, Joseph reached out, fingers brushing the cold dampness of her wrist. A pulse, faint but steady. "Hey," he called out, shaking her shoulder lightly. No response. Her face was partially obscured, but up close, he could make out the faint shadow of a bruise along her jaw, the fresh scrapes on her hands, small but telling. This wasn't just someone caught in the storm. Something had happened to her. His jaw tightened as he scanned the empty road. No other cars, no footprints leading away. Just her, alone in the mud, as if the storm itself had spit her out and left her there to rot. Rain dripped from his brow as he exhaled, making his decision. With little effort, he scooped her up, her body limp against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, her bones too sharp under the soaked fabric, and her breathing shallow. He carried her to the car, careful as he eased her into the passenger seat, adjusting her head against the leather. Slamming the door shut, he sat behind the wheel, wiping the rain from his face. He should take her to the estate. It was closer, easier. But the thought of handling an unconscious woman, bruised and half-drowned, in an empty house didn't sit right. Instead, he turned the car around and drove back the way he came, toward the hospital. She didn't stir, not when the tires splashed against the flooded roads, not when the distant lights of town began to break through the darkness. But in the faint glow of the dashboard, Joseph caught the slight twitch of her fingers, the way her brows knitted together even in unconsciousness, as if she were fighting her way back. Who the hell was she? And why did he have the sinking feeling that his return to this town had just gotten a lot more complicated? The fluorescent light buzzed faintly above them, casting an artificial glow over the pale blue hospital walls. A curtain, partially drawn, divided the small room in half, swaying slightly from the draft slipping under the door. The scent of antiseptic clung to everything, clean but suffocating. Joseph leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the rain streaking against the window. He had been standing there for a while, waiting for something, perhaps a nurse, a doctor, or maybe just the moment when leaving would no longer feel like abandoning the problem he had dragged in from the side of the road. Behind him, the rustling of sheets broke the stillness. He turned as the woman stirred, her brow twitching as her fingers clenched weakly against the blanket. Then, with a sharp inhale, she blinked, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room before landing on him. Her body tensed instantly. "You're awake," Joseph stated, pushing off the wall. She stared at him for a moment, then shifted slightly, wincing as she tried to sit up. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke. "Where am I?" "The hospital," he answered simply. "I found you on the road. You were unconscious." She exhaled, shoulders slumping as she glanced down at her hands, bruised, scraped, evidence of something she hadn't yet explained. Joseph watched her, waiting for more. When nothing came, he finally asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated, just for a second. "Rachel," she said. He nodded, absorbing that. "Joseph." Rachel's lips parted slightly, her eyes narrowing as if she were rolling the name around in her mind. You're not from here." "Not anymore," he admitted. "I used to be. Left a long time ago." Rachel's gaze flickered toward the window, her fingers picking absently at the corner of the hospital sheet. "You didn't have to bring me here," she murmured. "You were unconscious in the middle of the road. What was I supposed to do? Keep driving?" A humorless smirk tugged at the corner of her lips, but she said nothing. Joseph exhaled through his nose, studying her for a moment before he asked, "What happened?" Rachel's fingers stilled. She looked up at him, something careful, unreadable in her expression. "I don't remember," she said finally. He didn't believe her. He wasn't sure why, but there was something too controlled about the way she said it, like someone who had rehearsed the lie long before they ever needed to use it. Still, he didn't push. "You have anyone you want me to call?" Rachel shook her head. "No one." The answer sat between them, stark and final. Joseph could have left it at that, could have walked out, let the hospital handle the rest. That was the logical thing to do, the easy thing. Instead, he sighed. "There's a place you can stay, temporarily." Rachel looked at him sharply. "What?" "The Montgomery estate. It's empty. I'm dealing with some legal work there. If you need somewhere for a few days, until you figure things out." He shrugged. "It's an option." Rachel frowned, her gaze searching his face like she was waiting for some kind of catch. "Why would you offer that?" "Because I don't like the idea of you walking out of here with nowhere to go. Because I know what it's like to have a place that doesn't feel like home." Instead, he said, "The house is big. I won't even notice you're there." Rachel considered him for a long moment, weighing the offer. Finally, she exhaled. "All right." Joseph nodded. "I'll take care of the paperwork. Get some rest." And with that, he turned toward the door, leaving her with nothing but the hum of the hospital lights and the steady rhythm of the rain. The drive to the estate was quiet. Rachel sat beside him, arms crossed loosely over her chest, her gaze fixed out the window. The storm had weakened, but the roads were still slick, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the distant fields. Joseph focused on the road, hands steady on the wheel. He had expected her to ask questions, why he was doing this, why he cared, but she didn't. Maybe she wasn't used to kindness. Maybe she didn't trust it. When the estate came into view, Rachel finally stirred. It stood at the end of a long, winding driveway, partially obscured by overgrown trees and vines that had begun to creep along the stone walls. The house was grand in its own way, but age had settled into its bones. The windows loomed dark and empty, the once pristine columns now stained with time and weather. Joseph barely looked at it. To him, it was just another obligation. But Rachel, her gaze lingered, her fingers tightening slightly around her sleeve. "You've been here before?" Joseph asked, catching the look. Rachel blinked, shaking her head. No. Another lie. But, once again, he let it slide. They entered through the west wing, the only part of the house still fit to live in. The rest of the estate smelled of dust and disuse, furniture covered in white sheets, their silhouettes resembling forgotten ghosts. "This is yours for now," Joseph said, gesturing to the bedroom at the end of the hall. "The bathroom's down the hall." I think so. Kitchen's stocked. If you need anything, I'll be in the office." Rachel stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable as she took it all in. "Okay," she said finally. Joseph nodded once before turning away. The house had never felt so empty. The Montgomery estate groaned in the wind, its old bones shifting with the weight of time. Rain had stopped sometime in the early morning, but the dampness lingered, seeping into the wooden floors, curling at the edges of wallpaper that had begun to peel. Outside, the wind rustled through the overgrown fields, whispering through the trees in a way that made the house feel even more detached from the world around it. Joseph sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, his laptop open but untouched. His inbox was a mess of unread emails, meeting requests piling up like a weight on his shoulders. But he found himself staring past the screen, at the darkened window, where his own reflection looked back at him. Tired. Distant. A floorboard creaked behind him. Rachel stood at the entrance, her hands shoved into the sleeves of an oversized sweater she must have found in the closet. She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she should turn back, but then moved toward the counter, her gaze flickering toward his untouched coffee. "You always up this early?" she asked, voice still rough from sleep. Joseph leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples before reaching for his cup. "I never really sleep." Rachel hummed, opening one of the cabinets and frowning at its contents. "Did you at least buy real coffee? Or am I stuck with whatever's been in here since the 90s? Joseph smirked slightly, nudging the fresh bag on the counter toward her. "I don't like bad coffee." "Good. Because I might have had to leave." There was no warmth in her voice, but there was something else, something just a shade lighter than hostility. Joseph watched as she quietly moved through the kitchen, filling the old coffee pot, her movements careful, like she was waiting for someone to remind her she wasn't supposed to be here. She didn't ask for permission to sit, but when she did, she pulled her knees up slightly, wrapping her fingers around the ceramic mug like she needed the warmth more than the caffeine. Joseph took a sip of his own. "So, Rachel," he said, "are you going to tell me anything about yourself, or should I just start guessing?" She raised a brow. "Guessing sounds more fun." "All right." Joseph leaned forward. "You're on the run from something, or someone." Rachel took a slow sip, her expression unreadable. "Not quite. You left somewhere in a hurry. No bags, no phone, nothing on you but a cheap lighter and a torn sleeve." Rachel smirked slightly, shaking her head. "You're observant. I'll give you that." Joseph exhaled through his nose. "You don't have to tell me anything. I just need to know if there's a reason I should be worried." She met his gaze, steady and quiet. No reason. He didn't know if he believed her. The house was too quiet. Joseph had never realized how much silence could press in on a person, how the absence of life could make even the grandest spaces feel empty. He spent his days in his office, phone calls with contractors, lawyers, and his assistant in Chicago pulling him away from the reality of where he was. He could still picture the floor-to-ceiling windows of his high-rise apartment, the hum of traffic below, the efficiency of a life that made sense. But here there were too many ghosts. Rachel kept her distance, but Joseph knew she was wandering the house. He heard her footsteps sometimes, soft against the wooden floors, lingering in rooms she had no reason to be in. She never asked about the portraits that lined the halls, but she looked at them, her fingers brushing against the edges of their frames when she thought no one was watching. One afternoon, Joseph stepped out of his office, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders, only to find Rachel standing at the far end of the hallway, staring at a portrait above the grand staircase. It was an old painting, darkened with time, the figure in it dressed in a black suit, his sharp features framed by a gold-trimmed frame. "Who is he?" she asked, not looking away. "My grandfather," Joseph said, stepping closer. "Aaron Montgomery." Rachel let out a soft exhale, barely audible. "He looks like someone who got what he wanted." Joseph smirked, though there was no humor in it. "That's one way to put it." She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing as she examined the details, the set of the man's jaw, the confident way he carried himself even in oil paint. "I feel like I've seen this before," she muttered under her breath, almost like she didn't realize she was saying it out loud. Joseph's brows furrowed. "You sure you haven't been here before?" Rachel turned to him, her expression closing off so quickly it was like a door slamming shut. "No," she said flatly, "I haven't." Another lie. Joseph let it go. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and violet, Joseph found himself in the kitchen again, scrolling through messages on his phone, barely reading them. Rachel sat across from him, her hair still damp from a shower, pulling apart a piece of toast without eating it. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't exactly easy either. Joseph set his phone down. "Chicago's different," he said absently, as if he were just realizing it himself. Rachel glanced up, waiting. "I don't have to think about anything there. Everything moves fast, keeps me busy. Here." He exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "It's like everything slows down just enough to make me notice things I don't want to notice." Rachel was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "What kind of things?" Joseph looked at her, then shook his head. "Things I can't fix." Rachel considered that, picking up a stray crumb from her plate and pressing it between her fingers. "Maybe they don't need fixing," she murmured. Joseph didn't have an answer for that. The house creaked as the wind picked up outside, a long, tired sound. Rachel's gaze drifted toward the window, the reflection of the chandelier glinting off the glass. "You're gonna leave, aren't you?" she said after a while, her voice unreadable. Joseph exhaled, staring down at his coffee. "I don't know," he admitted. And for the first time, that was the truth. The secret behind this relationship will shock you. Comment strawberry if you're ready to accept it. It started early, before the sun had fully risen, before the house had settled from the restless night. The sharp rhythm of metal striking wood echoed through the halls, shaking loose dust from the rafters, rattling against the quiet that had settled into the Montgomery estate like a second skin. Joseph stood on the front steps, coffee cooling in his hands, watching as a team of workers unloaded supplies from their trucks. The estate had been waiting for this moment, for the scaffolding, the ladders, the men in dust-covered boots who would chip away at years of decay. It should have felt like progress. Instead, it just felt like noise. Rachel lingered in the doorway behind him, arms crossed, watching the workers with something like curiosity. She hadn't said much since they'd agreed to this arrangement, and he hadn't asked for more than she was willing to give. She was quiet, careful, but she wasn't intrusive. If anything, Joseph barely noticed her presence when he was wrapped up in phone calls and contracts. She spoke without looking at him. "So, you're actually fixing this place up?" Joseph exhaled. "That's the idea. You don't seem excited about it." He glanced at her. "It's a house, Rachel, not a dream." She tilted her head slightly, considering that, but said nothing. Instead, she stepped past him, descending the front steps and blending into the movement of the workers, hands in her pockets, gaze scanning the estate like she was seeing it through different eyes. Joseph watched her, sipping his coffee. It had been years since he walked through town like this, on foot, at a pace slow enough to actually take things in. Rachel walked beside him, just enough distance between them to keep things neutral, but close enough that he could see the way her eyes moved, reading signs, glancing at storefronts, taking in faces that weren't hers. The town had changed, but not in the way cities did. It had aged without reinventing itself, as if everyone had collectively decided that moving forward wasn't necessary. A few new businesses had popped up, but the brick buildings remained the same, their history embedded in the way their paint cracked, in the way the sidewalk dipped in the same places Joseph remembered from childhood. People recognized him, not with warmth, not with hostility, but with something in between, an awareness of who he was, a quiet acknowledgement that he had once been part of this place but had left it behind. Some nodded as they passed, others simply stared, as if trying to measure the years that had changed him. Rachel, on the other hand, received a different kind of attention. Newcomers were rare here, and even though she carried herself with a certain indifference, Joseph could feel the weight of eyes following her, lingering in the way small-town curiosity often did. She didn't react to it. If anything, she seemed used to being observed, yet untouched by it. At the hardware store, while Joseph discussed supplies with the owner, Rachel wandered between the aisles, fingers brushing against rough wooden planks, old nails in dusty boxes, tools she probably had no use for. She wasn't restless, but she wasn't comfortable either. When they left, she finally spoke. "They look at you like they know something about you that you don't." Joseph glanced at her. "Small towns don't forget." Rachel hummed, thoughtful. "But they do move on." Joseph wasn't sure if that was true. That night, the sound of construction had faded, leaving behind the remnants of dust, displaced furniture, and the scent of fresh paint beginning to battle the age-old mustiness of the house. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, turning a ceramic mug in her hands, watching the steam curl from the surface. Joseph leaned against the counter, half listening to a voicemail from his assistant in Chicago, something about board meetings and missed deadlines. "Did you ever want this?" Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a sharp edge. Joseph ended the call without responding, slipping his phone into his pocket. "What?" Rachel glanced up at him. "This place, this family name, any of it." Joseph exhaled, stepping forward to pull out the chair across from her. "No," he admitted. "Never." She didn't look surprised. Joseph ran a hand through his hair, leaning back. "My father left this place before I was born. He wanted nothing to do with it. I grew up in Chicago. This house was just a story I heard about in passing. It never felt real." Rachel studied him, fingers still wrapped around her mug. "Then why come back?" Joseph let out a dry laugh. "Obligation." Rachel took a sip of her coffee. "Obligation to what? A house?" "To what it represents," he muttered, almost to himself. "To the weight of it. You ever felt something pulling at you, even when you don't want it to?" Rachel was silent for a long time. Then finally, she nodded. "Yeah." Joseph looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since they'd sat down. She wasn't someone who offered much, but in that moment, there was something raw in the way she held herself, something that made him wonder if she knew exactly what he meant. For the first time, he felt less like an intruder in his own story. Rachel set her mug down, standing. "Guess you're not the only one haunted by things." She left the kitchen, disappearing into the dimly lit hallway, leaving Joseph alone with his thoughts, the hum of the refrigerator, and the lingering understanding that, whether they liked it or not, neither of them was truly alone in this house anymore. Then, finally, she nodded. "Yeah." Joseph looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since they'd sat down. She wasn't someone who offered much, but in that moment, there was something raw in the way she held herself, something that made him wonder if she knew exactly what he meant. For the first time, he felt less like an intruder in his own story. Rachel set her mug down, standing. "Guess you're not the only one haunted by things." She left the kitchen, disappearing into the dimly lit hallway, leaving Joseph alone with his thoughts, the hum of the refrigerator, and the lingering understanding that, whether they liked it or not, neither of them was truly alone in this house anymore. The Montgomery estate had begun to shift, not in the way of its foundation, but in the way a body shifts in sleep, restless, aware of something stirring beneath the surface. The workers came early and left late, their voices and the rhythmic pounding of hammers filling the empty spaces that had long since forgotten the sound of people. The scent of fresh sawdust and paint mixed with the lingering dust of decay. Joseph welcomed the distraction. He buried himself in repairs, in scheduling contractors, in keeping his hands busy. If the house was falling apart, at least it was something tangible he could fix. Rachel, however, was something else entirely. At first he barely noticed her. She moved quietly, never in the way, never drawing attention. But lately there were little things. A book slightly shifted on his desk, its placement not quite as he left it. His jacket, draped over a chair, refolded. A drawer, closed tighter than before, as if someone had been careful to cover their tracks. Small things. Things he might have ignored if not for the growing feeling that Rachel wasn't just observing the house, she was studying it. Or maybe studying him. The first time he caught her, it wasn't deliberate. He had left early in the morning to meet with the contractors, intending to be out for hours. But the meeting had wrapped up quicker than expected. By the time he pulled back into the long driveway, the afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows against the estate. He stepped inside, kicking off his boots, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. The house was unusually quiet, absent of the usual hum of the workers. Then he heard it, a drawer sliding open, the faint rustling of papers. His office. Joseph moved down the hall, his footsteps silent against the polished floors. When he reached the doorway, he saw her. Rachel was standing near his desk, her back to him, fingers sifting through a stack of papers he knew she had no reason to be looking at. For a moment, he didn't move. She was too focused, too careful, her shoulders tense, as if expecting to be caught. When he finally stepped inside, she startled, physically flinched, her fingers tightening around the paper before she set it down abruptly. "I was just..." Her voice wavered. That alone set off alarms. Joseph folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Looking for something?" Rachel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over her face like she was trying to wipe away her reaction. "I was tidying up." A blatant lie. Joseph didn't call her on it. He simply held her gaze, waiting. Rachel didn't look away, but there was something defensive in the way she squared her shoulders, something on edge. "Don't touch my things," he said finally, his voice even but firm. Rachel nodded once, too quickly, brushing past him without another word. Joseph let her go. But from that moment on, he started paying closer attention. Days passed, but the unease remained. The estate repairs continued, the workers stripping away rotting beams, reinforcing walls, breathing new life into a place that had been waiting for it. Joseph, however, was unraveling something else entirely. It was a Wednesday afternoon when it happened. He was in his office, answering calls, when he noticed something off. His assistant in Chicago had sent follow-ups and urgent messages referencing documents he was supposed to have reviewed. Documents he had never seen. He checked his sent folder. Nothing. Then, finally, he looked at his deleted emails. The missing correspondence was there. Someone had erased them. There were only two people who had access to his computer, himself and Rachel. The knowledge sat like a stone in his gut, cold and unmoving. He could have let it go, could have pretended it was some sort of technical error. But he wasn't that naive. Rachel had been in his office. Rachel had been going through his things. And now, Rachel had been inside his computer. Joseph didn't immediately confront her. He waited, he watched, and when the opportunity came, he took it. It was late. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. Joseph found her in the kitchen, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the table where she sat, her fingers idly tracing the rim of a coffee mug. She looked tired, or maybe just lost in thought. He stepped inside, his presence shifting the air just enough that she glanced up. "You deleted my emails." The words weren't loud, but they landed with the weight of something undeniable. Rachel froze. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she set down the mug, fingers pressing against the table's surface. "What?" Joseph leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You went through my things. You were in my office. And now, you've been in my computer." Rachel inhaled, but whatever she was about to say never made it past her lips. "Why?" Joseph asked, his voice steady but edged. Rachel's expression flickered, guilt maybe, or something sharper. "I didn't." "Don't lie to me." Rachel's jaw tightened. For the first time since she had arrived, he saw something crack in her. Something small but telling. She wasn't just caught. She was afraid. But afraid of what? Joseph exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "Whatever this is, Rachel, whatever you're doing, just tell me the truth." Rachel stared at him. Her fingers curled against the wood like she needed something to hold on to. Then, quietly, she said, "I don't do that." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse. It was resignation. Joseph didn't move. Neither did she. And between them, the house, old and knowing, seemed to breathe. Joseph didn't sleep that night. Not really. He sat in his office, staring at the glow of his laptop screen, the pale light reflecting off the glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. Outside, the storm had passed, but the wind still pushed against the house, rattling the old windows and slipping through the cracks like an uninvited guest. Rachel's voice lingered in his mind. "I don't do that. Not a denial, not an explanation. Just a refusal." That should have been enough. That should have been the moment he let it go. Let her disappear into whatever past she was running from. But instead, it was the moment he decided he couldn't. The next morning, Joseph made a call. The investigator's voice on the other end was gruff, no nonsense. A man used to untangling the knots people tried to hide. "Name?" "Rachel," Joseph said. Then, hesitating, "I don't know the last name." "I can send you a photo of her." There was a pause. "That makes it harder." "Not impossible." Another pause. A rustling of papers. "And what exactly are you looking for?" Joseph exhaled. "Anything. Where she's from. What she's not telling me." He hesitated, fingers tapping against the edge of his desk. "And why she's here." The investigator hummed. "I'll see what I can dig up." The line went dead. Joseph sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. Then he slipped it back into his pocket and went downstairs. Rachel wasn't in the kitchen that morning. She wasn't anywhere. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that settled when someone was deliberately avoiding being found. Joseph didn't call out for her. Instead, he grabbed his coffee and walked outside, letting the crisp morning air settle his thoughts. The workers were already here, moving through the property like an army of ants, stripping away the decay and hammering over history. Joseph exchanged nods with the foreman, but didn't stop to talk. His mind was elsewhere. Rachel appeared just as he was finishing his coffee. She was standing by the West Wing entrance, arms wrapped around herself against the cool air. She wasn't looking at him. Instead, her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the empty fields stretching out beyond the estate. She felt him before she saw him. You ever get the feeling that some places remember more than they should? Joseph studied her, the way her fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater, the way her voice sounded almost far away. "Yeah," he said eventually. Rachel turned, meeting his eyes for the first time that morning. This house remembers. Joseph didn't know how to respond to that. So he didn't. The investigator called 2 days later. "You're going to want to sit down for this." Joseph already knew. He could feel it in the way the silence stretched between them, thick and weighted. "She's a Carnegie," the investigator said. The name hit like a strike of lightning, splitting through him with sharp precision. The Carnegies. The name was buried in the history of this town, intertwined with the Montgomerys in a way that was anything but simple. A rivalry, decades deep. A family that had once stood on equal ground with his. A family that had fallen. And now, somehow, Rachel was here. His hand tightened around the phone. "You sure?" "As sure as I can be without a birth certificate in front of me." There was a pause. Then the investigator sighed. Her father was a Carnegie. Before he died, anyway. And as you know, in the past, the two families did not like each other. Carnegie failed, but Montgomery still developed. Now that the descendants of the two families are here, what do you think? Joseph leaned forward, pressing his free hand to his forehead. Rachel wasn't here by accident. She wasn't just a stray in the storm. She had chosen to be here. Joseph closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "Send me everything you find." He ended the call before he could hear the reply. Outside, the house was still under construction, the workers moving and talking, oblivious to the truth that had just unfolded inside these walls. Joseph sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the realization settle into his bones. Rachel was a Carnegie, and he had just let her into the Montgomery estate. Now the real question was, had she come to stay, or had she come for something else? The weight of truth sat heavy in Joseph's chest, pressing down like a hand against his ribs. It was late, past midnight, when he found her. Rachel was in the sitting room, curled up in the corner of a worn leather armchair, a half-finished glass of something amber sitting on the side table. The lamp cast a dim, flickering glow over the room, illuminating the sharp angles of her face, the distant look in her eyes. She didn't startle when he entered, didn't even look up. Joseph closed the door behind him, the click of it soft but deliberate. "I know who you are." Rachel's fingers tightened around the armrest. He waited, giving her space to deny it, to lie, to fight back. But she didn't. Instead, she exhaled, slow and measured, then lifted her gaze to meet his. "You had me investigated." Joseph didn't flinch. "I had no choice." Rachel let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "And what did you find, Joseph? That I wasn't who I said I was? That I walked into this house knowing exactly what it was? That I knew exactly who you were?" Her voice didn't rise, but there was something sharp beneath it, something that cut. Joseph took a step forward. "I found out that you're a Carnegie." The silence that followed felt deafening. Rachel leaned back into the chair, staring at the ceiling as if the answer was written somewhere in the cracks. "Then I guess there's no point pretending anymore." Joseph clenched his jaw. "Why are you here?" Rachel let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "Because I had nowhere else to go. Because this town is the only place that ever made sense." Her fingers curled into her palms. "Because I wanted you to suffer." Joseph stilled. Rachel closed her eyes for a second, inhaling through her nose before continuing. "My grandfather, George Carnegie, died in that house, the house your family took from us. He wasn't sick. He wasn't old. He was just done. He shot himself in the study, the one with the heavy bookshelves and the fireplace that probably hasn't been used in years." She let out a shaky breath. "My father found him, and after that, everything fell apart." Joseph didn't move. He didn't speak. Rachel's voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, something raw, something barely held together. My family lost everything. We weren't just ruined, Joseph. We were erased. The Carnegie name? It used to mean something in this town. But after the Montgomerys won, after your grandfather crushed us, people stopped saying it. We became ghosts. Her lips twisted. My father tried to fix things. He worked himself into the ground trying. But then one night, my mother's car spun out on the old bridge, and suddenly, it was just him and me. And when the factory laid him off, when he started drinking, when the weight of all of it became too much, one day, he just didn't come home. Joseph swallowed, but the lump in his throat wouldn't move. Rachel looked at him, something unreadable flickering across her face. I was 15. I had nothing, no money, no home, just a last name no one remembered. She shook her head. I didn't even know who to hate. She let out a short, bitter laugh. And then years later I came through town for work. I was just passing through, and I heard people talking. Did you hear? Joseph Montgomery's back. Her eyes darkened, and suddenly I knew exactly who to hate. Joseph exhaled sharply, stepping forward. So what was the plan, Rachel? What did you think was going to happen? Rachel's jaw tightened. I didn't know at first. I just wanted to be close enough to see, to know what kind of person you were, if you deserved any of this. She scoffed. But then, you weren't some entitled heir. You weren't living here in luxury. You weren't even connected to this place. You were just lost. Her fingers gripped the edge of the chair, and that made it worse. Joseph felt something crack inside him. Why? Because you didn't even care. Her voice broke on the last word, her breath shuddering out of her. All these years, I carried this weight, this anger, this legacy, and you... She gestured at him, shaking her head. You could have walked away. You did walk away. While I spent my whole life suffocating under what your family did, you were somewhere else, living a life untouched by any of it. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And that wasn't fair. Joseph inhaled, slow and deep, trying to make sense of it all. Rachel's shoulders were shaking, and then, suddenly, she was moving. Before he could react, before he could think, her hand disappeared behind her, and when it reappeared, there was a knife in her grip, a small blade, sharp and gleaming under the lamplight. Joseph didn't move. Rachel's breath was ragged, her hand trembling. Do you know how many times I imagined this moment? Joseph met her eyes. Then do it. The words landed between them, heavy and unflinching. Rachel's fingers twitched, her grip tightened, but she didn't move. Seconds passed, then another, and then, with a sharp inhale, the knife clattered to the floor. Rachel let out a strangled sound, something between a sob and a gasp, her hands gripping her face. I don't... Her voice cracked. I don't know how to hate you anymore. Joseph exhaled, his chest tight. He didn't say anything, didn't reach for her. He just turned and walked out. Outside, the night was cool, the wind carrying the scent of rain. The house stood behind him, heavy with ghosts, heavy with the past. He ran a hand through his hair, staring out at the fields, at the dark stretch of land that had been fought over for generations. Rachel was still inside, and for the first time, he didn't know what to do next. The morning after the storm felt eerily quiet. The sky was washed in pale blue, the damp earth still carrying the scent of rain. Inside the Montgomery estate, silence stretched between its walls like an uneasy truce. Joseph hadn't spoken to Rachel since last night, since she had stood before him, knife in hand, caught between hatred and something else she couldn't name. Now, as he stood in the front hall, he heard the distant sound of footsteps, steady, deliberate, moving up the gravel driveway. The workers weren't due yet. He turned toward the door just as the bell rang. Rachel, who had been sitting at the bottom of the staircase, stiffened. She hadn't left the house all morning, hadn't even looked at him when they passed in the hallway. Now, she seemed just as thrown as he was by the sudden visitor. Joseph opened the door. The woman on the other side was older, wrapped in a worn beige coat, a scarf tied neatly beneath her chin. Despite the chill in the air, her sharp eyes studied him like she already knew who he was. "You're Joseph," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. "And you are?" She pursed her lips, glancing past him toward the house. "I'm Olivia," she said. "My husband was Billy. He worked here." Joseph hesitated, the name sending a faint flicker of recognition through his mind. Billy, the last caretaker of the estate. The man who had looked after this place long after Joseph's family had abandoned it. "I need to talk to you," Olivia said. Joseph stepped aside, motioning her in. Rachel stayed near the staircase, silent as Olivia entered, her presence lingering like a shadow. "I didn't come for pleasantries," Olivia said, settling into a chair in the sitting room. Her hands were steady, but there was something careful about the way she moved, as if she were carrying something fragile. She reached into her bag and pulled out a wooden box. It was small, the edges worn from age, the latch rusted. "My husband kept this," she said, setting it on the table between them. "For years, he never opened it, said it wasn't his to touch. Before he passed, he told me to give it to the last Montgomery to set foot in this house." She met Joseph's eyes. "That's you." Joseph felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Slowly, he leaned forward and lifted the lid. Inside, time had been carefully preserved. A stack of photographs, their edges yellowed, a folded letter, ink faded but legible, and beneath it all, a key. Rachel had moved closer now, standing just behind him, her breath barely audible. Joseph picked up the first photograph. It was of two men, one in a suit, the other in a vest with his sleeves rolled up. Both young, both smiling. They stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the estate, the air between them easy, familiar. He turned it over, scrawled in the corner, in careful handwriting, "Aaron and George, 1947. Joseph stilled. Rachel sucked in a sharp breath. "My grandfather," she whispered, "and yours." Olivia nodded. "They weren't enemies," she said. "Not at first." Joseph placed the photo down, reaching for the letter. The paper felt brittle beneath his fingers as he unfolded it. The ink faded, but still legible. "Joseph, if you're reading this, it means you've come back. It means time has given you the chance to do what I never could. You deserve to know the truth. Your grandfather and George Carnegie were not the bitter rivals history remembers them as. They were friends, bound together by something deeper than family names. But when the Carnegie estate fell into debt, George made a choice. He asked Aaron for help, but not in the way the town believes. George's son, Randy, was the one who caused the downfall. In a fit of rage, he killed two men, workers at the Carnegie mill. There were witnesses. If word had spread, the family name would have been more than ruined. It would have been disgraced forever. Aaron did what George asked. He created the illusion of defeat. The Montgomerys won the land, the estate, the business. It was all a cover. In reality, he funneled money to the Carnegies so they could leave town, escape the scandal. But it wasn't enough. George, unable to live with the lie, took his own life. And the town, knowing only what it was meant to see, blamed the Montgomerys for it all. I have spent my life keeping this secret. Perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of fear, but it is not mine to carry anymore. The key belongs to Carnegie. This house was never meant to be taken, only borrowed, and now it is time to return it. Joseph read the letter twice, then a third time, as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes had seen. Rachel was trembling. "I was wrong," she whispered. Her voice was barely there. "All this time, I was wrong." Her grandfather wasn't a victim. Her family's downfall hadn't been a Montgomery attack. It had been a cover-up, a favor, a mercy. Joseph closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. Olivia stood, tucking her scarf tighter around her throat. "I've done my part," she said quietly. "What happens now is up to you." She left without another word, leaving the box, the photographs, the letter, leaving the truth behind. For a long time, neither Joseph nor Rachel spoke. The house, old and knowing, seemed to exhale around them. Finally, Joseph picked up the key, turned it over in his palm, then he held it out. Rachel hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. And for the first time since she had stepped into this house, she felt like she wasn't just passing through. She had come looking for revenge. And instead, she had found something much more painful. The past wasn't what she thought. And now, neither was the future. The air inside the Montgomery estate had shifted. It was heavier now, thick with something unspoken, something raw. Rachel sat on the couch, her posture unnervingly still. Her fingers rested against the key Joseph had handed her, but she hadn't moved since taking it. The weight of its metal against her skin felt almost unbearable. Joseph stood by the fireplace, staring at the box Olivia had left behind. The letter still lay open on the coffee table between them, its words echoing in his mind like the ticking of a clock. Steady, relentless. The truth was supposed to bring clarity, but all Joseph felt was the disorienting sensation of standing in a house where the walls had been rebuilt, only to realize the foundation was a lie. Rachel finally spoke, her voice low, almost as if she were afraid to break the silence. "All these years, I thought my family was destroyed by yours." Joseph turned slightly, watching her. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I grew up hearing about the Montgomerys. The name was a curse in my house, something whispered like a bad omen. My father, he never let it go. He carried the weight of our failure like a sickness. I grew up thinking we were victims, that your family ruined us." She exhaled sharply. "And all this time, we did it to ourselves." Joseph sat down across from her, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know either." Rachel let out a dry chuckle. "That's the worst part, isn't it? You never even knew. While I spent my entire life blaming you, you were living yours without a second thought about any of it." Joseph didn't deny it. What could he say? It was the truth. Rachel reached for one of the photographs from the box, the one of Aaron and George, side by side, smiling as if the world had not yet decided to turn them into enemies. Her fingers traced over the faded ink. "This wasn't just some business feud," she murmured. "This was personal." Joseph nodded. "And we were never supposed to inherit it." Rachel swallowed hard. "Randy." Joseph's brow furrowed. "Your uncle." She exhaled slowly. "I never met him. He disappeared before I was born. My father barely spoke about him, only that he had ruined everything. I never understood what he meant." Her grip on the photograph tightened. "Now I do." Joseph leaned forward. "If this letter is true, your grandfather was the one who asked for my grandfather's help." Rachel let out a sharp breath. "And then, he killed himself." The words landed between them like lead weight. Rachel turned the key over in her palm. "I came here because I thought I had a right to this house." She shook her head, laughing bitterly. "I thought I was taking something back, but I never even had a claim to it." Joseph stared at her for a long moment. "What are you going to do with it?" Rachel hesitated. For the first time since the truth had been laid bare, she looked lost. "I don't know." The quiet stretched between them. Joseph finally stood, pacing toward the window. Outside, the workers were still moving through the estate, hammering away at its broken pieces. His entire life, this house had been an obligation, a burden passed down through generations. Now, it was something entirely else. "You could stay," he said, surprising himself as much as her. Rachel looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Joseph leaned against the window frame, crossing his arms. You spent your life thinking you were supposed to take something back. Maybe you should figure out what it means to just have it. Rachel blinked, her fingers tightening around the key. And you? Joseph glanced over his shoulder. I don't know either. Rachel let out a breath, shaking her head. This house was never really yours. Joseph turned fully toward her. Maybe not, but it was never really yours either. For the first time since they had met, there was no anger between them, no accusations, no ghosts of the past clawing at their throats, just two people standing in the wreckage of a story that had never been theirs to tell. Rachel looked down at the key in her hand, and for the first time, she had no idea what to do with it. The days that followed were quiet. The house, once heavy with ghosts and buried resentment, now stood in an uneasy stillness, waiting for its fate to be decided. Joseph moved through it like a man untangling himself from something he had never realized was wrapped so tightly around him. He answered calls from Chicago, discussed figures and reports, set new deadlines. His assistant's voice over the phone reminded him of a world that had nothing to do with this place. Sharp, efficient, indifferent. Rachel, meanwhile, stayed. She had stopped wandering the house aimlessly, stopped reaching for history in the dust-covered corners. Instead, she spent hours sitting on the back steps of the estate, staring out at the land that once belonged to both their families. Sometimes, Joseph would pass by and find her there, her fingers turning the key over and over in her palm, as if testing its weight. Neither of them talked about what came next, but they both knew it was coming. The morning Joseph packed his bags, Rachel was in the kitchen. She didn't say anything as he walked in, just poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching as he grabbed his own. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. Joseph exhaled. "Yeah." Rachel nodded, staring down at her mug. "Back to Chicago. That's where my life is." She smirked slightly, shaking her head. "Is it?" Joseph hesitated. She looked up at him then, eyes searching, something unreadable flickering across her face. "You never really wanted this place," she murmured, "but you stayed longer than you had to." Joseph took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle against the weight in his chest. "I guess I had unfinished business." Rachel exhaled, glancing down at the key still in her hand. "And now?" Joseph studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out, pressing his palm over hers, closing her fingers around the key. "It's yours," he said simply. Rachel's breath hitched. "Joseph, it was never mine to begin with," he interrupted gently. "And it's not about the past anymore. It's about what happens next." Rachel swallowed hard, her grip tightening around the key. She had spent her whole life chasing ghosts, trying to reclaim something that had never truly belonged to her. Now, for the first time, she had a choice. "I don't know what to do with it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Joseph's lips quirked in something close to a smile. "Figure it out." Rachel let out a quiet, breathless laugh, shaking her head. "That easy, huh?" "Not easy," Joseph corrected, "but it's yours to decide now." Silence stretched between them, filled with something fragile but real. Then, finally, Rachel exhaled and pocketed the key. "Okay." Joseph nodded. He finished his coffee, set the empty cup down on the counter, and turned toward the door. Rachel didn't stop him. But as he reached the doorway, her voice cut through the air, soft but firm. "Joseph." He turned. She stood there, arms crossed, a hint of something vulnerable in her expression. "If you ever find yourself back here again." She hesitated, then smirked slightly. "Don't be a stranger." Joseph held her gaze for a moment. Then, with a small nod, he stepped outside, into the crisp morning air. Rachel stood on the front steps, watching as Joseph loaded his bag into the trunk of his car. The morning light cast long shadows across the driveway, the air still and quiet. It was the kind of silence that came after something had settled, after a choice had been made. Joseph moved without hesitation. His motions were practiced and efficient. He had always belonged to another world, one of deadlines and city streets, not old estates and buried histories. This place had never truly been his. But that didn't mean leaving was easy. He closed the trunk, resting his hands against the edge for a moment, before turning to face her. Rachel lifted her chin slightly, as if bracing herself. She had known this was coming. She had known from the moment he handed her the key that he wasn't staying. Still, the reality of it sat heavy in her chest. "Take care of it," Joseph said. Rachel glanced down at the key in her palm, the cool metal pressing into her skin. "I will." There was no grand farewell, no final words of closure, just the understanding that something had shifted between them, something unfinished but no longer burdened by resentment. Joseph exhaled, pushing his hands into his pockets. "You'll be all right?" Rachel smirked slightly, tilting her head. "I've made it this far." Joseph nodded, a flicker of something softer in his expression. "Yeah, you have." For a moment, it seemed like he might say more, but instead he stepped toward the car, pulling open the door. Rachel didn't move. She didn't try to stop him. She just watched. The engine rumbled to life, a sound that felt foreign against the quiet of the estate. Joseph gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the long, winding driveway ahead. He told himself not to look back. And yet, as he reached the edge of the property, something made him glance in the rearview mirror. Rachel was still standing there, her figure framed by the house behind her. For the first time, she looked like she belonged. Joseph swallowed, tightening his grip before shifting into gear. The past no longer weighed on him. But Rachel lingered in his mind. Rachel stood there long after the car had disappeared beyond the trees. The Montgomery estate was hers now, not in name, but in responsibility. She turned, letting out a slow breath as she stepped back inside, the door closing behind her with a quiet finality. There was work to be done, repairs to finish, histories to rewrite. Rachel pressed her palm against the wooden banister, running her fingers over its worn edges. For the first time, she wasn't chasing ghosts. She was building something new, and maybe, just maybe, one day, Joseph would come back. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.